Today we're looking at some amazing arms and armour at the Pitt Rivers Museum with my friend Todd as well. Hi folks, Matt Easton here of Schola Gladiatoria. Now, one of the amazing things about the Pitt Rivers Museum, when you have to visit it, it's got so much amazing stuff to check out. But one of the things which is really stunning is how much Indo-Persian, specifically Indian, edged weapons they have here. They have basically one of everything that you could want to see. And one of the reasons that I've asked to open up this cabinet, and very kindly they've obliged, and Todd and I are going to be looking at some of these things specifically in a second, is because you've got a lot of different types of Indian weapons in one cabinet here. So let's have a look at them. Right, so here's Todd. Thanks for coming in with me on this, and thanks for inviting me to come to the Pitt Rivers with you today. So we've been looking at a bunch of things, and I really wanted to get into this cabinet to look at some Indian swords. As viewers of my channel well know, I love Indian weapons, and this cabinet is great because, as you can see, there's a big old variety of things in here. So what's interesting as well with Indian weapons, and we've talked about this in the past, is we do see European blades. So from the 16th century onwards, a lot of European blades started being traded into India, and obviously they traded things outwards as well. So up at the top here we have a patta, sometimes known as a gauntlet sword, and that is probably an imported European blade. Sometimes they are, sometimes they're not, but they tend to be double-edged broadsword blades, and we sometimes see Solingen written on them, which is the dead giveaway.
I mean, what I find interesting is, although they might be Indian weapons and European blades, they're not mounted in the same way as European blades are mounted very often.
No.
But talking of that patta at the top there, have you ever used one? I mean, I haven't.
So I do own one, and I have waved it around. I can't say I've used one. There are actually still to this day experts who use them, and in the 19th century British writers actually talk about people doing displays with them. And one of the tricks they used to do is they used to do lots of spinning movements and cut a lemon in half underneath someone's foot.
Yeah, okay.
So
there's a YouTube film bit like that.
So there were certain kind of like, you know, display tricks and stuff they used to do with them, but they were famously used by the Marathas. So this is the iconic, not to say that they were the only people that used them, but that is very much seen as the Maratha national weapon.
But I mean, and you say you've waved it around, and there's going to be skills involved in it, but it looks so alien compared to a European sword.
Yeah.
How is it?
Yeah, it's weird. It is weird, and it's very weird cutting with something that's projecting outwards straight in line with your forearm like that. And you would think that they would make good thrusting weapons because it's a bit like a large punch dagger or katar, which we've got some other examples in the museum. But as far as we can tell, they were virtually never used for thrusting. They're pretty much only used for cutting.
I can imagine that, because you've got a limited ability to move in that. And with the dagger, for instance, you can get right out, you can right back in. It's going to limit your ability, your style of fighting, and how you're going to fight an awful lot. It
would be very difficult to get it back out again if you pushed it in with that particular grip.
Your opponent has to be at exactly that sweet spot, and if they're not there or not here...
I mean, the other thing to say about them is sometimes they were used from horseback, so sometimes you might literally be riding past and just hold the thing out rather than swinging it. But they were used on foot as well, and they are shown used on foot, and people have a dagger as a backup weapon, either a katar or a jambia or whatever. And very occasionally they were used dual-wielded with one in each hand, because why not? But then if we come down from that, we have a sword that's commonly called a Ferengi, which actually comes from the Persian word for Frankish, just basically means European. And the reason is because they are so often mounted with backsword blades, and that's a big old European backsword blade there. But you'll notice these blades were imported in, and you mentioned how the construction's different. And it's even true here, because although it's got, at first sight, a more conventional hilt arrangement, the Indian blades are usually riveted via languettes to the hilt. Now that's not to say they don't also have a tang going through, and there will be a tang going all the way through here to this stalk, and we'll talk about the stalk in a second. But they do seem to like to rivet these languettes either side of the blade, which is an interesting way of doing things. We only really see that in Europe in like the Bronze Age, for example. We sometimes see Bronze Age blades riveted like that.
Well, I'm going to say what I usually say is, if anybody actually knows why why they did that, and not just fashion or, if there is a reason beyond that, love to know it.
Yeah, and it's interesting as well because later talwar aren't usually riveted through like that. They are usually glued.
Yeah. Which again is just not the European way.
No, and so their grip on this, although you can see this has still got organic, it's difficult to see what it is, but inside there will be an iron tube. So the tang is really a thin tang that goes through an iron tube, and then around the iron you usually put leather or fabric, usually both. And here we've got was known in the 19th century by British writers as the Hindu basket hilt. Now bear in mind they described India as Hindustan, so it just basically means the Indian basket hilt as opposed to the Scottish basket hilt or whatever. Yeah. So it's an Indian basket hilt, so it's a very protective hilt. This type of sword was also used by the Marathas, but the Rajputs and various other people as well. And it has a hollow pommel, as we see on some European swords, of course.
For me, again, that's evident because that would be such a heavy, big chunk of steel at the back there.
Yeah.
It wouldn't work.
Yeah, and again, these are used usually with a shield. They can be used on horseback or on foot. They're kind of similar to a European backsword, essentially. Good hand protection, big blade, straight blade.
It's a long blade.
Yeah, very, very long. And what's interesting is, in Europe, the backswords tend not to be as long as the backsword blades that were sold to India, basically. And then at the end we've got this stalk. Now the stalk can serve several purposes, but one of the main ones is actually to bring up your left hand and use it temporarily as a two-handed sword. And usually the end of the tang goes all the way through that stalk, and sometimes on old ones you see this little terminal, the finial at the end breaks off, and you can see the end of the tang inside sticking out.
But the tang, if it's that thin and to bend around that, isn't serving a purpose as a tang anymore. No. It does seem they were quite, maybe with these rivets here as well and having the tang going on, they're quite concerned about keeping that hilt and that blade together. Yeah. So maybe they had some insecurity about that being a common failure previously. And then we've got these two swords here. So that's would sometimes be known as a patissa, and that would usually be called a kanda. Now they are actually clearly related swords. Now the important thing to note is that curved swords, the talwar type blade or shamshir type blade, is something which comes in with the Mughals. So when the Islamic invasions came in 15th, 16th century, they brought these swords largely from Persia and Afghanistan with them. But prior to that, if we look at ancient Indian art, we generally see either straight blades or forwards curved blades. So this... I've not seen forwards curved.
Yeah. So it's really the ancestors of the kukri as well, actually. So these straight blades are more traditional Indian styles of blade than the later backwards curved saber blades, which are really more of a Persian thing.
These I'm finding both very interesting myself. The top one of the pair has a very strange cladding to the blade, really, which of course has now completely removed its ability to be sharp by the look of that.
Yeah.
But then the bottom one has got the weirdest guard.
Yeah, so funnily enough, that type of guard is the ancestor of these basket hilts here. So if you look at the shape here, we've got a large angled plate, and that is that. And you see the pommels are vaguely similar. That's actually a later talwar style pommel, but that goes into that. And that is the type of sword, when we look at, say, 13th century Indian friezes on temples, for example, that's the type of sword we see them wielding. It's straight. Funnily enough, although it's straight, it's single-edged, usually. So that is actually edged on that side, but not always on that side. And that's why the later one has the cladding up the back to strengthen and rigidify the blade.
But again, the second one up, though, because you've got the cladding on the first 20 centimetres of the blade, 18 centimetres. Again, that very European thing, for instance, of giving draw cuts with the blade when it's close on the guard, that's not possible with it.
No.
So it's not a surprise that the fighting styles would be very different.
Yeah.
But something that is a little utility in Europe is just not here, even though it could easily be so.
Yeah. And one last thing to say about this style of blade shape with this bulbous tip is it's clearly not designed for thrusting.
No.
You could thrust with it, but it's not going to have great penetration because it's such a broad surface area. But it does mean you can cut all the way up to the tip of the blade, because you've got that mass distribution still up there, that it's essentially a bit like some falchions or a bit like a machete, frankly. So you can still cut very well at the tip.
You see that a lot on cat's belgas as well. I mean, there's one I've seen where it actually is blunt at the not blunt, but flat at the end.
Yeah, absolutely.
But certainly never pointed on a cat's belga.
Yeah.
And that's kind of actually, that second one up is comparable blade length, in fact.
Yeah, absolutely. So just quickly, there's a few weapons over here I want to look at quickly. Now, this one here is really quite an unusual type of weapon. Now, we use the word dao for it. So dao is a general word.
So where's this from, sorry?
So this is from southern India, and it's from an area or group of people called I think it's Khasi or Kazi. I'm not really sure how to pronounce it correctly. It's Khasi. So we could call it the Khasi Dao. Now the problem with the word Dao is a little bit like,
isn't it?
well, yeah, and it's the same root word. So whether we go to Southeast Asia, Far East Asia, we find this word Da, Dao. It basically means an edged weapon. It basically means knife. So the problem is it's a very non-specific name. We don't have a great specific name for these, as far as I'm aware.
It's like saying sword.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, or chopper or whatever. You know, but this is a very unusual and characteristic style of blade. I think these are sometimes.
I love the blade.
Yeah, I think they're sometimes known as fish-tail dao, if I remember correctly. But it's almost like a falchion or langmesser blade in terms of that sort of clipped point, except that the clip point's extended.
But the length of the handle means there's going to be an awful lot of flexibility about how you choose to use it.
Yeah, and you know, again, I don't know any source material for how these were used. These are very rarely described because only one group of people use them, and that's why they're very rare. My assumption is it is a two-handed weapon, like a longsword. And we seem to have this sort of like secondary guard up here. So it's got what looks like a cross guard on a European sword, and then it's got another one up there.
I was just about to ask. So is it missing something because you have a hole through here? It looks to me like a wider thing was once on there. And it may be organic and it's glued in place.
I don't know, but they always have a projection, so they always have two cross guards, and I'm not entirely sure how they're constructed. But also, the other thing that's worth mentioning is they're completely iron. The whole thing's iron. There's no organic material there at all, at least now. So there's no covering to the grips, and I haven't seen any with coverings to the grips.
No, it looks to me like there never was on that.
But it's unusual because it's a form of longsword. It's almost like a longsword. In fact, I'll come down here to this one here. So that's a Nepalese kora. And there is an unusual thing about this one, and that is that it has this cusped tip. And normally they're square tipped. But I think everybody knows the Gurkha kukri, and that's the traditional knife of Nepal. But what most people don't know is the kora, which is the traditional sword of Nepal. So what they usually went into war with actually was the kora. They'd have a kukri on their belt, but this was more of the primary weapon.
Quite a short thing.
Yeah, absolutely.
It's a short falchion short, isn't it?
Yeah, but very, very choppy. And they've got a very characteristic two-disc style, a little bit like a rondel dagger.
Very much like a rondel dagger, which we've talked about, like that rondel sword we once looked at.
Yeah.
Rondel sword. It doesn't lend itself to being a particularly good sword hilt. So, I don't know, it's kind of a weird one.
It is curious.
It shares the same sort of family resemblance, if you like, because those are almost rondel type hilts.
And that's the thing. So we know, again, from 19th century British sources, they studied and they talked about the ways of using weapons in India, which were still, prevalent at that time. And a big point is made of these disc-like pommels and them cutting with a stiff wrist. So rather than letting the wrist extend out as we'd normally cut with a sabre, for example, them keeping a locked wrist and flexing at the elbow and shoulder and putting the whole body into it so that you drag and draw the blade across. And this is so-called kind of the Indian drawing cut, but they did the same in places like Turkey and Persia and other places as well. So it does seem that the Indian hilts do accentuate that way of cutting, and possibly in Nepal they had a similar philosophy.
Well, they're neighbours, aren't they?
Yeah, absolutely. Last couple of swords to look at down here. This one is a recurved blade.
Beauty again.
Lovely.
That blade is like straight off some of the stuff I do for Witcher.
Yeah, and I absolutely love that. So that's called a Sozan patta. And again, that is an older ancestral style of Indian blade that we find in India before the more typical talwars. I should also mention to the viewers, We have loads of tulwars and there's loads of tulwar over there. There is so much here at the Pitt Rivers. There's just tons and tons of it. I would absolutely love to start rooting through all of those boxes up there, but there's lots of more typical tulwars up there, but you've seen tulwar a lot on my channel, and that's the most prevalent and the most common type of Indian sword, but these are the kind of the other ones. So the Sözün patta is probably related to the yataghan, which is a type of Turkish sword. But was also used in Persia.
Number 14 there on the left is just an absolute beauty. Again, it looks like a fantasy piece with the way that the pommel flares at the end.
It's a gorgeous shape. It's
Absolutely
very aesthetically pleasing. And
is it an eared pommel? I can't see from here.
Yeah, something. It's along those lines. So I think that's actually a Persian one, but it's probably Ottoman inspired, because obviously all these places, neighbouring areas, they sometimes took inspiration from.
Or they get excited about other people's technology.
Yeah, and they introduce it, and then they do their own take on it. So that doesn't look like an Ottoman yataghan, but you can see inspiration from it.
Oh, but it's beautiful.
Yeah, so and so the advantage of this kind of blade is you've got that forward curving edge, which gives you chopping advantage, but then when it recurves back, it brings the point in line with the grip again, so it's good for thrusting. And a guy called Colonel Mary Mong, who was a French cavalry commander serving in North Africa, he was obsessed with swords, a bit like me, and he wrote a book, a memoir on swords, and he talks about all the different types of sword blades and what they're good for and what people should use. And he was a big fan of the yataghan blade, which is the same kind of recurved blade as this. And he was the reason, probably, that the French and later the British military adopted the yataghan blade for bayonets, because they considered it a really good combination. Last one to look at down here is the shamshir. Now, a lot of people, when they see a shamshir, think of a Middle Eastern sword. Well, that's because that's where it came from. So, as I mentioned, the curved saber blade came in via Persian and Mughal invasions. But that essentially is the Indian version of a Persian shamshir, and the word shamshir is a Persian word. So they literally imported the sword style, the word for it, and a bunch of other Farsi words as well.
What's just occurred to me though, looking at both the hilt and the scabbard construction on here, staggeringly similar to Polish saber.
Well, and again, because it's the same route, yes. So via Turkish and other Ottoman expansion, there was a spread of certain styles. So you find, so within Ottoman Turkey, you find the kilich or pala, but you also find the shamshir. So the shamshir and the pala spread to the areas that the Ottomans were in contact with, and that included Eastern and Central and Eastern Europe as well.
So hence Hungary and Poland.
Absolutely. So Hungary and Poland, they had their own shabla, they had their own styles, but these fused with and mixed with the should we say, kind of Islamic areas, I guess, that were expanding and bringing in these other styles of, and you know, the Mamluk sabre, as we call it, that the British generals wore from 1831 onwards, is just copied. They went to campaign in Egypt, they saw some Ottoman shamshir and they copied them. Yeah, so again, these were literally imported from Persia and also copied in India based on Persian ones, and that almost certainly is a Wootz steel
I was
blade.
just trying to look for that actually. It's too much
and interestingly, often the Wootz steel originates in India, was exported to Syria, was made into sword blades in Syria, and then exported back to India.
Well, my understanding is the smelting areas for it were North India and Afghanistan. But it found its all the way to Europe as well. You know, we find Wootz steel, and it just amazes me, Wootz steel from Afghanistan or Northern India in Viking blades, you know, 900 AD. It's just amazing to see it.
Yeah, so, you know, there's a bunch of, I think we've probably talked enough, but we've got Sri Lankan Piaketa and various other, we've got a Qatar up there and Chilinam daggers. We've got so many, this case alone, it has got, 20 examples of really different iconic Indian weapons. And one of the amazing things about Indian arms and armour is how each different group of people had their own distinctive preferences. And so, you know, obviously kukri is famous from Nepal, and you've got Burmese or Myanmar famous types. But, you know, famous for the Marathas, famous for the Sikhs. The Sikhs have a particular love for the kanda, and it's even part of their emblem. And you know,
but of course, it wasn't one nation
others.
as we're imagining
No,
it to be now.
no.
So it's not a surprise that you have distinct cultural
absolutely.
differences. I mean, there still are. It still is in India.
And
distinct
so many
cultural
wars and clashes of different, you know, tribal and religious groupings, and that really wanted to have their own sort of strong identities. So just fascinating cabinet. Anyway, yeah, thanks a lot for sharing that with me, Todd. And I think we need to get to another cabinet and have a look at some more things now.
Yeah, this is just the beginning of many films. So goodbye. Thank you. Cheers, Matt.
Cheers, folks. Cheers, Todd.